So I had this talk with one of my students the other night, and it occurred to me that this is kind of a coaching principle that I've used for a while that might be useful to some coaches out there or possibly to some competitors who wish they had more coaching available than they do have. And that was, I talked with a competitor who primarily does individual events about what it is that separates a beginner from a champion. And what I have said for a lot of years is there are three T's involved: talent, technique, thought-provoking. Talent, technique, thought-provoking. I'm going to blow through the first two because I think that you probably understand almost instinctively how talent and technique come into it, but then thought-provoking is the real separator. To start off with talent, it really is the case that some people are just going to have a lower bar in particular forensics events than other people are going to. I had a student years ago when I was at Arizona State. His name was Brian Davis, and I was working mostly with the debaters, and he was doing mostly individual events, so I didn't work directly with him that much. But his event, one of his best events, was after dinner speaking, or speech to entertain. You might find it more familiar by that title. And in 1998, he, as a junior in college, was the AFA national champion in after dinner speaking. And the thing about it was, he was just naturally funny. He was just one of those people. He had that kind of chemistry. And the speech that won him AFA, about 30 seconds into it, he just made a facial expression. And it was one of the biggest laughs in the speech. And other people could approximate that facial expression, but they just couldn't pull it off. What he had was talent. What he had, and as I understand it, to hear him talk about it, he had had it all his life. It had just been very, very easy when he was around other people. They were 3/4 of the way to laughing anyway, so he could just nudge it a little further with the way he delivered things, and people would just bust up laughing. And so when you're looking at the events that you do, I'm a big believer in taking events that you don't have a lot of talent for and working very, very hard on them. I'll go ahead and disclose, I didn't have any talent as a debater. Thinking like a debater came very, very hard for me, and I worked and worked and worked, and forgive me, but I'm a little bit proud of how much progress I made just getting to the point where, as a debater, I was kind of on the outer rim of the nationally good college debaters, and I could take down good debaters. I was not likely to string together enough wins to win a major tournament, but because I worked against my talent, I developed a skill set that I didn't begin with, and that was the product of good old-fashioned hard work. But it really is the case that all things being equal, the people who are going to win, the people who start off with a lot of talent, they have a big head start. Now, secondly is technique. And it really is the case that people who put in the hours, people who learn the fundamentals and the building blocks, people who know how to make really, really good eye contact, not stilted eye contact, not artificial eye contact that calls attention to itself, but about one thought per audience member, very soft, very natural. You look as though you are having a conversation, not as though you're staring, not as though you're doing an eye contact drill. People who work to refine that and tweak it and hone it until the audience members are really made comfortable and they feel recognized and it looks natural. When you put in the time to get that really, really shaped down to what it needs to be, to what works well, that's something that is going to give you a competitive edge, and that's nothing but good old-fashioned hard work. Same thing with enunciation, same thing with projection. In college, when you do oral interpretation events, you have to use a little black notebook. Well, you don't have to use the notebook. You have to use a manuscript. The convention is that people use a notebook, and there are particular agreed upon ways for handling that notebook. And people who put in the time to do it, in particular people who do dramatic duo, and they put in the time to where they can synchronize their movements to where it looks sharp. People who very, very obviously have worked on the building block behaviors of any given forensics activity, they are going to set themselves apart. Now, those were the two that I think are kind of obvious. People who are talented have a head start. People who put in the work to develop the technique, they are going to have a competitive edge. But the third and final thing is the one that you really have to design in. It's not just a matter of doing the event over and over again to discover where are your talents, to discover what is the technique and how can I get better, but to be thought-provoking. One of the things you have to remember is that a lot of the people who judge forensics events, well, it may be a little bit different for NCFCA and STOA. The leagues that I've coached in, a lot of the people who judge forensics events, particularly at nationals, they have seen so many rounds of competition over the years that they all kind of start to run together. So the one that they will vote for, the one that they'll give the one to. They may give the one to the person who's just got so much chemistry and charisma because they're talented, or the one who is so precise and, you know, I would love for my students to see what you're doing because it's perfect, and that's all about technique. But the thing that you can do in the design of your event is you can try in some way to challenge them, try in some way to be thought-provoking. Let me give you an example. I've already mentioned that in oral interpretation events, what you do at the college level is that you have a manuscript and you tend to hold it in a small black binder. Well, we got to thinking. I have one member of my team who is pretty close to fluent in American Sign Language, and I remember reading a number of years ago that a musical, Broadway musical from the 1980s, Big River, which was based on the book Huck Finn, that it had been restaged in the early 2000s by an all-deaf theater company. And the way they staged it, they had performers stand in the wings, speaking hearing performers who spoke the lines and who sang the lyrics of the song, but in the middle of the stage, they had deaf performers who were doing the lines in sign, and when the songs were going on, they would all sign, sometimes all in unison. And people who went to see this just thought it was absolutely wonderful, especially because, you know, the story of Huck Finn, Huck and Jim, Huck coming to understand that Jim is not an animal, that Jim is a human being with feelings like himself, with daughters that he desperately misses. And there's a song in there, Worlds Apart. And when you have deaf people performing for a hearing audience and they're singing, you see the same sun through your, or you see I see the friendship in your eyes that you see in mine, but we're worlds apart, worlds apart. It was really, really powerful, and I thought, dramatic interpretation. And one of the things that the student's name is Peter, one of the things that he did, he began with a book in his hand, and he said we would never think of excluding someone from forensics competition because they weren't white or male, even though we did so in the past. But when we have the expectation that performers will perform with a manuscript in their hand, and at this point he threw the book over his shoulder and began to sign, and he said deaf people are excluded. And when he went into the piece, he did Huck speaking, and then he did Jim speaking but also signing. And in the middle he also sang a couple of excerpts from the songs. He's got a great singing voice. But the thing was, he challenged the use of the book. And that interp piece became an argument about some of the things that we take for granted are keeping some people out of the activity who could really do a pretty magnificent job of presenting certain kinds of literature if only we weren't a little bit narrow-minded about how it's supposed to be done. And he went to the first tournament of the year, the Lewis and Clark tournament up in Portland, and fairly good-sized tournament. He's never done an oral interpretation event. I didn't put him in novice, I didn't put him in JV, I put him in open, and he came within one ranking of winning the tournament. He actually came in second, and, you know, qualified for NFA with that. So, the point that I'm making there is, can you take the way the event is practiced? And this, I call this the way that you separate yourself from beginner and the way you make progress toward being champion. Because you have to be around the activity for a while to really see how people practice it and then think, is there something about this that I can challenge? Is there something about this that is just sort of par for the course, just sort of conventional wisdom? Sometimes sociologists call this the invisible curriculum. It's the way things are done. Nobody will write it down. Nobody will necessarily teach it to you, but if you watch, you'll see that everybody is expected to know it. Can you find those things about your event, and can you shake them up? Not in childish ways, not in just mindlessly disruptive ways, but in intelligent ways that have a purpose. There's an informative speech that I keep pitching this idea to various of my students, and I have yet to have one get really excited about it, but I would love to have a student give an informative speech about the human brain. And not to describe the latest research breakthrough about the human brain, because there are 10 of those a week, but just to say this speech is about misinformation, about ideas that we have about the human brain that are not accurate. Because that's not the way informative speaking is ordinarily practiced. Ordinarily it's, here's a research breakthrough, here are the implications, here are the limitations. It usually has to do with medicine or with some sort of health-related issue. Occasionally it's something else, like here's how poor communities are going to be able to collect water using this new technology. But a speech about correcting misinformation, and it wouldn't have to be about the human brain, it could be about a lot of different things, but that would go to the heart of how the activity is ordinarily practiced, and for judges who've seen everything, it would shake it up. So if you are at that juncture where you feel like you've got your legs under you and you have the basics down for your events, and you're working on your technique and you think you have a good measure of talent, what I would encourage you to do is start to analyze the event and figure out, these are all the things I'm supposed to do. Is there one that I could challenge in an intelligent way to where the judge could see why I'm doing it that way, and in so doing set myself apart? In my experience, watching and seeing what wins over several decades in this activity, I've seen that that is a powerful force multiplier for people who want to jump to the next level.